But Grandma, this is the family overflow table? My daughter-in-law, Susan, said it with a tight little smile. The air was thick with the smell of lilies and expensive perfume. The sound of a string quartet drifted over from the main hall. She pointed to a small round table tucked away behind a large potted fern. It was right next to the swinging doors to the kitchen. I could already hear the clatter of plates and the loud voices of the staff. The tablecloth was a slightly different shade of white. It didn't have a floral centerpiece, just a single, sad-looking candle. 3 other people were already there. 2 distant cousins of the bride's mother and an old neighbor I vaguely recognized. We were the leftovers, the odds and ends. I looked past Susan's shoulder. I saw my son, Mark, at the head table, laughing with Tiffany's father. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I saw my grandson, Kevin, the reason we were all here, holding his new wife's hand. They were sitting on chairs that looked like golden thrones. I had paid for those thrones. In fact, I had paid for the whole grand hall at the Willows estate. My social security checks and the money my dear Frank left me had paid for it all. Overflow, I repeated softly. The word felt cold and sharp. Susan's smile faltered. Well, you know, Tiffany's family is so large, we just ran out of room at the main tables. She patted my arm, her rings cold against my skin. You understand. I looked at the little table again, then back at her perfectly made-up face. And in that quiet, humming moment, I did understand. Perfectly. I walked away from Susan without another word. My feet felt steady on the polished marble floor. I didn't look back. I found my coat in the cloakroom. A simple cloth coat among all the furs and cashmere. The attendant handed it to me with a polite smile. He had no idea. Outside, the cool night air felt good on my face. My car, a reliable 10-year-old Buick, was parked at the far end of the lot. I sat inside for a moment, the silence a relief after the forced cheerfulness of the party. The leather of the driver's seat was cool against my back. I could still hear the faint thumping of the music from the reception hall. I took out my checkbook from my purse. The final payment. $15,000. I had written the check that morning, my hand steady, my heart full of love for my grandson. I looked at my signature on the bottom line. Carol Henderson. It looked like the signature of a stranger. I picked up my cell phone. The screen glowed in the darkness of the car. I found the number for the venue manager, a Mrs. Davis. I pressed the call button. "The Willows, this is Diane," a voice answered. "Mrs. Davis, please," I said, my own voice calm and even. "It's Carol Henderson." After a short pause, she came on the line. "Mrs. Henderson, is everything all right? Are you enjoying the evening?" I took a slow breath. "Mrs. Davis, I'm calling about the final payment for the wedding. Check number 4351. I need you to know I am placing a stop payment on it first thing in the morning." Just 2 months ago, Kevin and Tiffany had been sitting at my kitchen table. The whole room smelled of the apple pie I had just taken out of the oven. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming the old oak table my Frank had built. Kevin couldn't stop fidgeting with his fork. "Grandma," he started, his voice low. "We found the perfect place for the wedding." Tiffany jumped in, her voice all excitement. "It's called the Willows Estate. It has gardens and a ballroom. It's like a fairy tale." "But—" She looked down at her hands. "We just can't afford it. Not the deposit and the final payment. We'd have to wait for years." I looked at my grandson's hopeful, worried face. He was a good boy. I had rocked him to sleep in this very house. I cut a large slice of pie for him and one for Tiffany. "Nonsense," I said, pushing the plates toward them. A wedding is a celebration. It shouldn't be a worry. I went to the little desk in the corner and pulled out my checkbook, the same one that was now in my purse. "How much is the deposit?" I asked. When Tiffany told me the amount, my hand didn't even tremble. I wrote the check and handed it to Kevin. He looked at it, then at me, his eyes wide. "Grandma, we can't ask you to do this." I just smiled. "You didn't ask. I offered. Family helps family." He and Tiffany both hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Their joy was all the thanks I needed. Or so I thought. I got home just before 10 o'clock. The house was quiet. The only sound was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a sound that had comforted me for 40 years. Tonight, it just made the silence feel bigger. I took off my coat and hung it in the closet. I sat down in my favorite armchair, the one with the faded floral print, and pulled the old Afghan over my lap. The soft yarn felt familiar and safe. My son, Mark, had once called this house Grandma's Museum. He and Susan were always trying to get me to sell it, to move into one of those modern senior living condos. "It's too much for you, Mom," he'd say. But I loved my house. I loved the smell of old books and the lemon polish I used on the furniture. Every scuff on the floor held a memory. I turned on a small lamp. Its light cast a warm yellow circle in the living room. I found a simple blank card in my desk drawer, the kind you buy in a pack of 10 at the grocery store. I took out my good pen, the one I used for writing Christmas cards. My hand was perfectly steady. In my neatest script, I wrote just 5 words. "A gift should be appreciated." That was all. I folded the card, slipped it into an envelope, and addressed it to Mr. and Mrs. Kevin Henderson at the venue's address. I put a stamp on it and left it by the front door, ready for the morning mail. The next morning was Sunday. The church bells started ringing at 9, their sound clear and familiar in the morning air. I usually never missed a service. I loved seeing my friends at the potluck afterward. But today, the thought of their kind, questioning faces was too much. I couldn't bear to tell them where their potluck queen had been seated at her own grandson's wedding. Instead, I put on my old gardening clothes and went out to my rose bushes. The sun felt warm on my back. The soil was cool and damp in my hands as I pulled out the stubborn little weeds. It was good. Simple work. My phone, which I'd left on the patio table, started to buzz. I glanced over. A call from Mark. I watched it ring until it stopped. A minute later, a text message lit up the screen. "Mum, call me now." I went back to my weeding. The phone buzzed again. A text from Susan. "Carol, what have you done? The venue is calling us." I ignored it. Then a third message, from Kevin. "Grandma, what's going on?" "Tiffany is crying." I reached over, picked up the phone, and turned it face down on the table. The buzzing stopped. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of roses and damp earth. I was not at an overflow table. I was in my garden. And for the first time in a long time, I felt perfectly, peacefully, in the right place. Around noon, a car door slammed outside. I didn't have to look out the window to know who it was. Mark used to slam his car door the same way when he was a teenager, and I'd told him he couldn't borrow the car. A few moments later, the doorbell rang. A long, insistent press. I opened the door. Mark stood there, his face red and tight. Susan was right behind him, her arms crossed, looking like she'd just smelled something spoiled. The air still held the scent of my cut roses from the patio. "Mum?" Mark said, his voice clipped. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" I just looked at him. "I'm about to have a cup of tea. Would you like to come in?" Susan pushed past him. Don't play games, Carol. The venue called us this morning. They said you stopped the check. You embarrassed us. You embarrassed Kevin and Tiffany on their honeymoon. I stepped back and let them into the entryway. The grandfather clock ticked steadily. There was no gift, I said quietly. So there was no payment. Mark threw his hands up. For what? Because of a seating arrangement? You were at the overflow table. It wasn't a big deal. That's right, I said, looking straight at Susan. The family overflow table. You said it yourself. They didn't stay long. Susan realized I wasn't going to argue. Mark just seemed confused, like a child who had been told no for the very first time. They stood in my living room, surrounded by pictures of the family they were so angry for. There was a photo of me holding Mark as a baby on the mantelpiece. He didn't look at it. We'll pay it, Mark finally said, running a hand through his thinning hair. We'll have to take out a loan, but we'll pay it. I just can't believe you would do this to your own grandson. I nodded. That's your choice, Mark. Susan let out a sharp, frustrated sigh. This is ridiculous. Over a table. They left. I listened to their footsteps on the porch, the slam of the car door again, and the sound of their engine roaring to life and then fading down the street. I went into the kitchen. My tea was still hot. I took a sip. The warmth spread through my chest. I felt calm. The house was quiet again. It was a good kind of quiet. On Monday morning, I went to the bank. It was a bright, clear day. The bank was mostly empty, just the low hum of the air conditioner and the quiet tapping of keyboards. I went up to a young teller named Maria. She always had a kind smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," she said. "What can we do for you today?" I took the checkbook out of my purse. "I called on Saturday night to place a stop payment on a check," I said. "I just want to make sure it's all official." She tapped on her computer. Her painted fingernails were a cheerful shade of pink. "Yes, I see it here. Check number 4351. It's been stopped. The funds are secure in your account." I felt a wave of relief, so strong I had to grip the cool marble counter for a second. It was done. Truly done. "Thank you, Maria," I said. "You've been a great help." As I walked out of the bank, the automatic doors sliding open with a soft whoosh, I felt lighter. I decided not to go straight home. I drove to the little diner on Main Street and ordered a full breakfast for myself. Pancakes, bacon, and coffee. I sat by the window, watched people walk by, and took my time. That afternoon, I was repotting an orchid when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, so I let it go to the answering machine. After the beep, a hesitant voice filled the quiet room. "Grandma, it's Kevin. Please pick up. Grandma, please." I stood still, my hands covered in soil, and listened. "Dad and Susan told me what happened," he said. His voice was strained. I could hear Tiffany crying softly in the background. I don't understand. We didn't mean to." It was just a mistake with the seating chart. Tiffany's mom made the chart. It was chaotic. "Please, Grandma, can't you just fix it? This is costing us so much money we don't have." His voice cracked on the last few words. The machine clicked off. The silence rushed back in. I looked at the beautiful, delicate orchid in my hands. It needed care and the right conditions to bloom. You couldn't just stick it in a dark corner by the kitchen and expect it to thrive. I wiped my hands on my apron and went back to my plant. I did not call him back. On Tuesday, my best friend Eleanor stopped by. She brought a Tupperware container with her famous lemon bars. "I missed you at church," she said, setting the container on my kitchen counter. The sweet, citrusy smell filled the air. I figured something was up. We sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea. I told her everything. I didn't cry or raise my voice. I just laid the facts out, one by one, like setting the table for dinner. The check, the hall, the little table behind the fern, the swinging kitchen doors. Eleanor listened, her brow furrowed. She took a bite of a lemon bar and chewed thoughtfully. When I finished, she reached across the table and patted my hand. Her hand was warm and wrinkled, just like mine. "Carol Henderson," she said, her voice firm. "It's about damn time." We sat there for a moment in comfortable silence. Then she smiled. "You know, the community center is starting a new pottery class on Wednesday nights. We should go. It would be good to get our hands dirty with something besides weeds and family drama." I looked at her, then at my own hands, still a little stained with potting soil. And for the first time since Saturday night, I smiled a real, genuine smile. "I think," I said, "that sounds absolutely perfect." The first pottery class was on Wednesday evening. The community centre smelled of floor wax and chalk, but the art room smelled wonderful, like damp earth and rain. Eleanor was already there, wearing a big denim apron and looking completely at home. A dozen of us sat at potter's wheels. The instructor, a young woman with clay smudges on her cheek, showed us how to center the clay. The wheel hummed beneath my hands. The wet clay felt cool and alive as it spun. It was messy. It was difficult. My first attempt collapsed into a sad, grey lump. "Don't you worry," Eleanor whispered, her own pot already taking shape. Mine looked like a sick mushroom the first time. The instructor came over. "You're holding on too tight," she said kindly. "You have to guide it, not force it." I took a breath, relaxed my shoulders, and tried again. By the end of the night, I had a small, wobbly bowl. It wasn't perfect, but I had made it. The next day, I pulled a heavy box down from the top of my hall closet. It was filled with Frank's old files, the air filled with the dusty smell of old paper. I sat at the dining room table and sorted through everything. The deed to the house, our marriage certificate, his life insurance policy, my will. I hadn't looked at my will since Frank passed away 10 years ago. I read through the familiar legal language. It was simple. Everything went to Mark, my only child. He was to inherit the house, the savings, the investments, everything. At the time, it had seemed like the most natural thing in the world. I laid the document flat on the polished wood of the table. The afternoon sun made a warm square of light on the page. My phone rang. It was Susan. Her voice was syrupy sweet. "Carol, I was just calling to see how you are. We're all so worried about you, being all alone in that big house." I looked at the will on the table. "I'm quite all right, Susan. Thank you for asking." "Well," she continued, "Mark and I were thinking, maybe it's time you let us help you manage your finances. It can be so overwhelming." I almost laughed. "I think I'm managing just fine," I said, and hung up the phone. On Friday, I had an appointment with a lawyer, Mr. Davies. His office was on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. It was a quiet place, with dark wood shelves full of thick books. The air smelled of coffee and lemon polish, just like my own house. Mr. Davies was a calm man, with grey hair and kind eyes. He didn't rush me. He poured me a cup of coffee in a plain white mug. It felt warm in my hands. "So, Mrs. Henderson," he began, "you said on the phone you wanted to review your estate plan." I nodded and pushed my old will across his big, tidy desk. "I want to make a new one," I said, "from scratch." He looked at the document, then back at me over his reading glasses. "Are we expecting any major changes?" he asked gently. I took a sip of the coffee. It was a little weak, but I didn't mind. "You could say that," I said. "I've decided to make some new investments in people who appreciate the gift." Mark came by on Saturday afternoon. He showed up alone, which was a surprise. He stood on my porch, holding a small box of pastries from the good bakery. He looked tired. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Can I come in?" I let him in, and we sat in the living room. The grandfather clock ticked between us. He didn't seem to know what to say. "I miss you, Mom," he finally said, looking at his hands. "I miss our Sunday dinners. Kevin misses you. It feels like you've just decided we're not your family anymore." I looked at his face, the face I had loved and worried over for 45 years. He was trying to find the right buttons to push. He just couldn't find them anymore. "Mark," I said, my voice even and calm, "your son's wedding was a business transaction. I was the bank, and when my part of the transaction was done, I was moved to a storage area by the kitchen." He winced. "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that," I replied. I looked at the picture of my late husband, Frank, on the mantel. "My love," I said, my voice clear and steady, "was not a line of credit for you to draw on." That evening, Eleanor and I went out for dinner. We went to a little Italian place that had checkered tablecloths and candles stuck in old wine bottles. The air smelled of garlic and oregano. We ordered lasagna and split a small carafe of red wine. "So, the lawyer is drawing up the new papers?" she asked, cutting into her pasta. "He is," I confirmed. "He said it will be ready to sign next week." Eleanor raised her glass. The candlelight flickered in the dark red wine. "To new beginnings," she said. I clinked my glass against hers. The sound was a small, happy chime in the busy restaurant. "And to better centerpieces," I added. Eleanor laughed. When I got home that night, the house didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I took the stack of old mail off the center of my dining room table. I knew exactly what I was going to put there instead. Something a little wobbly, maybe, but entirely my own. I signed the new will the following Tuesday. Mr. Davies's office felt familiar this time. The pen he gave me was heavy and cool in my hand. His secretary, a pleasant woman named June, was a witness. My signature, Carol Henderson, looked strong and clear at the bottom of the page. I felt a quiet click inside me, like a lock settling into place. "It's all done," Mr. Davies said, stacking the papers neatly. "The original will be kept here in our safe. This is your copy." He slid a thick envelope across the polished desk. It felt substantial, real. "What about my son?" I asked. "Does he need to be notified?" Mr. Davies shook his head. "Not at all. The contents of your will are entirely private until the time comes." I nodded, tucked the envelope into my large purse, and stood up. The leather of my purse strap felt solid on my shoulder. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Davies." "My pleasure, Mrs. Henderson," he said with a small smile. "My distinct pleasure." That week, my little wobbly bowl from pottery class sat in the center of my dining room table. It held 3 lemons from my neighbor's tree. Every time I walked past, the bright yellow against the earthy brown of the clay made me happy. It was a small thing, but it was mine. I received a letter in the mail. The envelope was thick and creamy, with the embossed logo of the Willows estate. It was an invoice, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Mark Henderson. It was for the final balance of $15,000, with a polite but firm note about a late fee that would be applied in 10 days. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I took a pen, crossed out my address, and neatly wrote Mark and Susan's address on the front. I put it in a fresh envelope, added a stamp, and dropped it in the mailbox at the end of my street. The little red flag went up with a satisfying clank. At my next pottery class, I was feeling more confident. The clay felt less like an enemy and more like a partner. The hum of the wheel was soothing. Eleanor was working on a large platter, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I got a call from Tiffany today," I told her, keeping my eyes on the spinning clay. "Oh?" Eleanor said, not looking up. "What did the little bride want?" I carefully pulled the clay upwards, forming the walls of a mug. She was crying again. She said they had to cancel their honeymoon to Mexico to pay the venue. She said I ruined the best time of her life. Eleanor snorted. If the best time of her life was a week in Cancun paid for by her husband's grandmother, she has a sad life ahead of her. I smoothed the rim of the mug with a wet sponge. It was starting to look like a real mug. "I didn't say anything," I told Eleanor. "I just listened." After a while, she ran out of things to say and hung up. "Good," Eleanor said. "Silence is an answer too." I started going through the house, room by room. Not cleaning, exactly. More like curating. I packed up a box of Mark's old childhood trophies and school projects from the attic. They were covered in a thick layer of dust. I packed away the fancy crystal vase Susan had given me for Christmas 3 years ago. I'd never liked it. I found a box of old photographs. There was one of me and Frank on our wedding day. We were so young. Frank was smiling, his arm wrapped tightly around my waist. I took the photo out of the box and bought a simple silver frame for it at the drugstore. I put it on my bedside table where I could see it every morning. This house wasn't a museum of my family's life. It was my home. I was filling it with things that brought me joy, not just memories of obligations. I bought new, cheerful yellow curtains for the kitchen. I threw out the lumpy old pillows on the sofa. I made small changes, but they felt enormous. On Sunday, I went back to church. I walked in just as the organ started playing. The air was filled with the familiar scent of old wood and lilies from the altar. Several friends waved and smiled. I slid into the pew next to Eleanor. She gave my hand a squeeze. After the service, we went to the potluck in the church basement. The room buzzed with happy chatter and the clatter of plates. I brought a simple green bean casserole. Nothing fancy. As I was getting a slice of coffee cake, I saw Susan's mother, Mary, across the room. She was talking to another woman and kept glancing over at me. She finally made her way over, her plate piled high with food. "Carol?" she said, her voice a little too loud. I was so sorry to hear about that unpleasantness at the wedding. I simply smiled. "It's all been handled, Mary. Thank you." She leaned in closer. "Susan is just beside herself. She says you've changed." I picked up a napkin and carefully wiped a crumb from my fingers. "Yes," I said, looking her right in the eye. "I suppose I have." A few weeks later, I was in the grocery store. I was in the produce aisle, trying to pick a good cantaloupe. The store smelled of fresh bread from the bakery and the cool mist from the vegetable sprinklers. I heard a familiar voice behind me. "I thought that was you, Carol." It was Martha, one of Susan's friends from her bridge club. She was a woman who always looked perfectly put together. Today was no exception. "Martha," I said with a polite nod. "How are you?" She lowered her voice, a conspiratorial look on her face. "I just have to say, what you did was the talk of the town for a week. Susan was telling us you had some kind of episode, but honestly, good for you." She patted a melon as if testing it for ripeness. "Between you and me," she whispered, My son and his wife expect me to babysit their 3 monsters every weekend for free. They call it grandma time. I call it unpaid labor. She winked at me, picked up a bag of grapes, and walked away. I stood there for a moment, holding my cantaloupe. It seemed I wasn't the only one who had been sitting at an overflow table of one kind or another. I started making a list. Not a grocery list, but a life list. I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh notebook and my good pen. The sun streamed in through my new yellow curtains. The first thing I wrote was, learn to bake sourdough bread. The second was, visit the Grand Canyon. Frank and I had always talked about going. I added more things: plant a vegetable garden, join a book club, volunteer at the animal shelter. The list grew longer. It was full of things that were just for me. Not for my son, not for my grandson, just for Carol. Looking at the list, written in my own hand, I felt a spark of excitement I hadn't felt in years. The page smelled faintly of paper and ink and possibility. I called the community centre the next day. "Hello," I said, my voice clear. "I saw a flyer for your bus trip to the Grand Canyon next month. Do you have any spaces left?" The woman on the other end tapped her keyboard. The sound was faint over the line. "Yes, we have one spot left, a single seat." I smiled. "I'll take it," I said. "Put me down for one." The day before my trip, Mark showed up unannounced again. He was holding a large envelope. He looked pale and stressed. "Mum," he said, walking into my living room without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." He threw the envelope on the coffee table. It was the invoice from the Willows estate. A bright red "past due" was stamped across it. "We can't pay this," he said, his voice tight. "We took out a loan to cover what we thought it would be. But with the late fees, Susan and I are fighting all the time. This is destroying us." I looked at him, then at the invoice. The grandfather clock ticked away the seconds. "That is a bill for a party you attended, Mark. Not me." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. "But you were always supposed to pay for it. That was the plan." I folded my hands in my lap. The wool of my sweater was soft against my skin. "Plans change," I said. "You of all people should know that. One minute you have a seat at the head table, the next you're at the— what was it Susan called it? The family overflow table." He had no answer for that. My suitcase was packed and sitting by the front door. It was a small, practical suitcase, one I hadn't used in a decade. I had packed comfortable shoes, a good book, and a new camera. I felt like a girl going off to summer camp. Eleanor came over to water my plants while I was gone. She brought a thermos of coffee and 2 mugs. We sat on my front porch swing. The morning air was cool and smelled of dew on the grass. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "A little," I admitted. "I haven't travelled alone since— well, ever." "You're not alone," she said, nudging my shoulder with hers. "You're just on your own. There's a difference." We drank our coffee in comfortable silence, watching the neighbourhood wake up. A paperboy rode by on his bike, the whirring of the wheels a familiar sound. "Send me a postcard," Eleanor said as she left. "I will," I promised. "A tacky one." The bus was filled with other seniors. The seats were comfortable, and the big windows gave a great view. The low rumble of the engine was almost relaxing. I sat next to a gentleman named Arthur. He had a kind face and a neat white moustache. He was reading a history book. "First time to the canyon?" he asked, looking up from his book as the bus pulled onto the highway. "Yes, it is," I said. "My husband and I always meant to go." He nodded. My wife and I went for our 25th anniversary. She passed a few years ago. I'm going back for her. He said it so simply, without any self-pity. We talked for a while. He was a retired history teacher. He told me about the geology of the area we were driving through. I told him about my roses and my pottery class. It was easy. There was no history between us, no expectations. We were just two people on a bus, heading west. The sun was bright, and the road stretched out ahead of us, open and wide. The Grand Canyon was bigger and quieter than I ever imagined. The air was thin and clean, and the silence was a sound all its own. Arthur and I stood at the railing, looking out at the vastness. The rock formations were painted in shades of red and orange by the setting sun. Frank would have loved this, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He always loved a big view. Arthur didn't say anything, just stood beside me. It was nice, not having to fill the silence. We stayed until the first stars appeared in the deep purple sky. On the bus ride back to the hotel, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known was possible. I sent Eleanor a postcard of a donkey wearing a sombrero. When I got home, my house smelled a little dusty, but it smelled like my home. The mail was in a neat pile on the kitchen table, courtesy of Eleanor. On top was a postcard from Mexico. It was a picture of a perfect white beach. The message on the back was from Kevin and Tiffany. "Having a great time. Wish you were here." There was no mention of the $15,000. I put the postcard in the recycling bin. The phone call came 2 days later. It was Susan. Her voice was bright and false, like a plastic flower. "Carol, you're back. We were so worried. Did you have a nice time on your little bus trip?" I looked at my new mug from pottery class, sitting on the counter. "It was lovely, Susan. How are you?" "We're fine. Just so busy," she chirped. "Listen, we're having Thanksgiving at our house this year. Of course, we're expecting you. Dinner is at 3. It wasn't a question. It was a summons. She was telling me my place was set, and I was expected to fill it. The old me would have started planning which pies to bake." "That sounds nice," I said calmly. "I'll be there." I could almost hear her relief through the phone. "Wonderful," she said. "Could you bring your famous sweet potato casserole and maybe a pecan pie?" I smiled to myself. "I'll see you at 3, I said, and hung up before she could add anything else to the list. I had no intention of bringing a casserole. I arrived at Mark and Susan's house at 3 o'clock sharp. The air was thick with the scent of roasting turkey and sage stuffing. The sound of a football game blared from the television in the family room. I was carrying a small, nicely wrapped gift box. Susan opened the door, her smile tight when she saw I was empty-handed except for the box. "Carol? You're here? Where's the casserole?" "Happy Thanksgiving, Susan," I said, stepping inside. I brought a hostess gift instead. I handed her the box. It was one of my new pottery mugs. Mark came out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on an apron. "Mom, glad you could make it?" He seemed awkward, unsure how to act around me. Kevin and Tiffany were sitting on the couch looking at their phones. They both mumbled, "Hi, Grandma," without looking up. I was a ghost in their house, a necessary piece of furniture for the holiday. We sat down to dinner at a long, polished table. It was perfectly set with Susan's best china and silver. I was seated at the far end, next to Tiffany's second cousin. It wasn't the overflow table, but it was close. The meal was full of polite, meaningless chatter. Mark carved the turkey. Susan passed the mashed potatoes. No one mentioned the wedding, or the money, or the cancelled honeymoon. They were pretending it had all gone away. After a while, Mark cleared his throat. "So, Mum," he said, in a voice he probably thought was casual. Susan and I were talking. We think it's time to start thinking about the future. Your house is just so big for one person. Susan jumped in. We found a wonderful real estate agent. She thinks we could get a great price for it in the spring. You could move into a lovely condo, something more manageable. I placed my fork and knife neatly on my plate. The room went quiet. Even the television in the other room seemed to have paused for a commercial break. Actually, I said, my voice perfectly level, I've already made arrangements for the house. Mark stared at me. Arrangements? What arrangements? I took a sip of my water. The glass was cool and smooth in my hand. I met with my lawyer a few weeks ago, I explained. I've updated my will. The house is being left to the county animal shelter. Frank and I got our first dog from there. They do good work. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Susan's face was pale. Tiffany had actually looked up from her phone, her mouth hanging slightly open. You... what? Mark stammered. And my investment portfolio, I continued, looking directly at my son, has been placed in a trust. It will fund a scholarship for students at the community college who want to study a trade. Pottery, for instance. Susan finally found her voice. It was a harsh whisper. You're giving our money away. You're giving Kevin's inheritance to strangers and dogs. I looked at her, my expression calm. It was never your money, Susan, I said. It was a gift you simply expected. And as we've all learned, a gift should be appreciated. No one touched their dessert. The pumpkin pie sat on the counter, uncut. The air in the dining room felt thick and heavy. Mark just kept shaking his head, looking from me to Susan and back again. I don't understand, he kept saying. After everything we've done for you. I finally picked up my purse from the floor beside my chair. The leather felt smooth and familiar. I think it's time for me to go, I said, standing up. Thank you for the dinner. Susan shot up from her chair. You can't just leave. You drop this bomb on us and just walk away. Her voice was getting shrill. I looked at her, then at my son, then at my grandson, who was staring at his plate as if it held the answers to the universe. I'm not walking away, I said quietly. I'm walking toward my own life. There's a difference. I didn't wait for a reply. I walked down the hall, let myself out the front door, and closed it gently behind me. The cool night air felt wonderfully clean on my face. The next week was quiet. I didn't hear from Mark or Susan. Not a phone call, not a text. It was a strange kind of silence, heavy with anger, but I found I didn't mind it. It gave me more time for my own things. I joined a book club that met at the local library on Tuesday mornings. The library smelled of old paper and quiet concentration. We sat around a big oak table, about 8 of us, all women of a certain age. We were discussing a novel about a woman who starts a new life in Italy. I'd love to go to Italy, a woman named Margaret said, just to eat pasta and drink wine for a month. Another woman, June, laughed. My children would have a fit if I went away for a whole month. Who would watch their dog? We all chuckled. It felt good to be in a room with women who understood. I didn't have to explain anything. Arthur, the man from the Grand Canyon trip, called me. Carol, he said, his voice warm over the phone. I was wondering if you might be free for lunch this week. There's a little cafe that has the best tomato soup. I was surprised, but in a good way. I'd like that very much, Arthur, I said. We met on Thursday. The cafe was cozy, with mismatched chairs and sunlight streaming through the front window. The air smelled of soup and baking bread. The tomato soup was as good as he'd promised. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about his time as a teacher, and I told him about Frank and my garden. "It sounds like you have a full life," he said, stirring his coffee. "I'm working on it," I replied. "I spent a lot of years tending other people's gardens. Now I'm focusing on my own." He smiled at that. It was a nice, genuine smile. When he walked me to my car, he didn't try to hold my hand or anything like that. He just said, "I had a very nice time, Carol." And I knew we would see each other again. I started volunteering at the animal shelter twice a week. It was noisy and chaotic, and it always smelled faintly of bleach and dog food. But I loved it. I spent my time folding laundry, filling water bowls, and sitting with the scared, lonely cats. There was one old tabby cat with a torn ear who nobody wanted. He would just sit at the back of his cage and hiss at everyone. The shelter workers called him Grumpy. I started sitting by his cage every time I came in. I didn't try to pet him. I just talked to him in a low, calm voice. I told him about my roses and my pottery class. One afternoon, as I was talking, he slowly came to the front of the cage. He stretched out a paw and gently touched my finger through the wire mesh. His paw was rough, but the touch was soft. The shelter manager saw it. "Well, I'll be," she said. "He's never done that with anyone." I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the shelter's faulty heating system. Just before Christmas, I received a stiff, formal letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer I didn't know. The paper was thick and expensive. It stated that his client, Mr. Mark Henderson, intended to contest my will. It claimed I was not of sound mind when I made the changes and was being unduly influenced by outside parties. I read the letter twice. I should have been angry or scared. Instead, I just felt a deep, weary sadness for my son. He would rather spend money on a lawyer to fight me than just pick up the phone and talk to me. I put the letter on the kitchen counter next to a bowl of oranges. I went into the living room and turned on the radio. Christmas music filled the quiet house. I looked at the photo of me and Frank on our wedding day. He was looking at me with so much love. I knew what he would have said. "You handle it, Carol. You always do." And I knew he was right. I would handle it. I took the lawyer's letter with me to my next appointment with Mr. Davies. I laid it on his desk between us. He put on his reading glasses and read it slowly. The only sound in the office was the quiet ticking of a clock on his wall and the rustle of the thick paper in his hands. When he was finished, he took off his glasses and looked at me. "Carol," he said, his voice calm and steady. "This is what we call a saber rattle. It's designed to scare you. Is it going to be a problem?" I asked. I felt surprisingly calm. The thick rug on his office floor seemed to absorb all my worry. He shook his head. "To prove you're not of sound mind, they would have to prove you don't understand your own assets or who your relatives are. Your decision was rational. Unusual, perhaps, but perfectly rational." He folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope. "We will send a polite, firm response. Don't you worry about this for another minute." I left his office feeling 10 pounds lighter. A few days later, I went to the animal shelter. I walked back to the cat room, the familiar smell of bleach and dry food in the air. Grumpy was sitting at the front of his cage, waiting for me. I opened the little door, and he rubbed his head against my hand, his purr a low rumble. A young couple with a little girl came in. The girl was looking for a kitten. "Oh, not that one, honey," the mother said, pointing at Grumpy's cage. "He looks so old and mean." They moved on quickly. I watched them go. Then I looked at the old tabby cat with the torn ear. He wasn't mean. He was just a leftover, an item in the overflow section. I found the shelter manager. "I'd like to fill out the adoption papers," I said, my voice clear. "For Grumpy." Her eyes widened. "Really, Carol? Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said. "I'm going to call him Frankie." An hour later, I carried him out to my car in a cardboard carrier. He was quiet the whole way home. Frankie settled into my house, as if he had always lived there. He found the sunniest spot on the living room rug for his naps. He loved to sit on the kitchen windowsill and watch the birds. His steady, rumbling purr became the new soundtrack of my quiet home. The grandfather clock ticked, and Frankie purred. It was a peaceful duet. For Christmas, I didn't go to Mark and Susan's. I didn't even get an invitation. Instead, Eleanor, Arthur, and I had dinner at my house. I cooked a small roast chicken. The house smelled of rosemary and garlic. We drank sparkling cider from my good glasses and talked about books and gardening. Arthur gave me a beautiful book about the national parks. Eleanor gave me a set of handmade pottery tools. I gave them each a mug I had made, glazed in a deep blue color. There were no expectations, no obligations, just the warm, easy comfort of real friendship. After they left, I sat by my little tree with Frankie asleep on my lap. The soft weight of him was a comfort. I felt perfectly content. One afternoon in late winter, I saw Tiffany at the pharmacy. She was standing in line, looking tired. Her expensive coat was unbuttoned, and her hair was messy. She didn't see me at first. When she did, her face froze for a second. "Hello, Tiffany," I said quietly. "Grandma Carol," she said. Her voice was flat. We stood in silence for a moment. The air smelled of antiseptic and cheap perfume. Are you happy?" she asked finally, her eyes on the floor. It was a real question. I thought about it. I thought about my quiet mornings, my pottery classes, my new cat, my friends. "Yes," I said. "I am." She nodded, as if that was the answer she expected. "That's good," she whispered. When her turn came, she paid for her prescription and left without looking back. I never found out if she was happy, but I hoped she would be, someday. Spring came. The first of my rose bushes started to bloom. They were a deep, velvety red, just as Frank had loved. The lawsuit from Mark had gone nowhere, just as Mr. Davies predicted. I'd received one last angry letter, and then silence. It was over. One bright Saturday morning, I woke up early. The sun was streaming through my yellow kitchen curtains. I made a pot of coffee and carried a mug out to the front porch. Frankie followed me, winding around my ankles before settling on the top step to wash his face in the sun. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new blossoms. The church bells began to ring in the distance. I took a sip of my coffee. It was hot and strong, and the mug I'd made myself felt solid and good in my hands. I looked at my garden, at the quiet street, at the cat purring at my feet. My house was quiet. My life was simple. And for the first time I could remember, it was completely, entirely my own.